We'll now move on to our second session. Manreet Sodhi Someshwar, her latest work on Partition trilogy explores the impact of India's partition on cities like Lahore, Hyderabad, and Kashmir. The trilogy intertwines historical events with a fictional narrative, and her work is praised for its meticulous research and compelling storytelling. Let us listen to Manreet as she shares emotional and literature challenges of writing about partition. And in conversation with her, we have none other than Nirmala Govindarajan, yet another author renowned for her lyrical exploration of social issues, particularly human trafficking. Her latest novel, Taboo, addresses the lives of girls trafficked into sex trade, where she is using a mix of realism and magical elements to tell their stories. Let's give a big round of applause to them.
So in India, a lot of us have transited from the pen and paper to the mobile phone. We are trying not to use paper. So thank you so much, Ala, for having us here. It's such an honor to be in the United States for the first time, and that too amidst a literature-loving audience with Manreet. So I met Manreet years ago, when she wrote this book, The Taj Conspiracy. And she spoke, I was in that session, I was a journalist then, and I was reporting that event. She was in conversation with a renowned theatre person in Bangalore. And she spoke of how, what intrigued me about the way she spoke about the Taj Conspiracy itself was, there was the thought, the plot, the people, the post-its that, dressed your drawing board, because she's a very strategic person and she comes from this management background. I think you studied at IIM. You're an IIM grad, Cal. And that kind of clearly showed in the way, she had gone about both researching her book and writing the story, which was an excellent book. I mean, I think I really had good fun reading The Taj Conspiracy at that time. And so take us through the challenge of how you integrate your emotion and your creativity with your strategic mind to construct evocative stories of mystery and partition.
Well, thank you, Nirmala, and thank you to all of you for turning up on a Saturday morning to listen to us. Hopefully, your time will be rewarded through this conversation. And as Nirmala mentioned, I first met her in 2012 when my book, The Taj Conspiracy, came out. And it seems like a long time away because through that time, I have managed to write more books. And my latest is something called the Partition trilogy, which, as the name implies, has 3 books, which, in case you haven't heard about them, is Lahore, which is book 1, Hyderabad, which is book 2, and Kashmir, which is book 3 of the Partition trilogy. Now, as Nirmala also mentioned, I did not train as a writer. I went to engineering school and then business school and had a corporate career in India, in Bombay largely, for 10 years before I did this very sudden switch to writing. And I've now published 9 novels. And it seems like I've been on this journey of trying to uncover partition, because that is some way or the other is a leitmotif in all my writing. And the reason for that is my hometown. I come from a small town on the border between India and Pakistan. It is a cantonment town. It's called Firozpur. And by the laws of India's partition, since it was Muslim majority in 1947, it should have gone to Pakistan. But it didn't. It stayed within India. And indeed, when you look at the map, you can see that a squiggle, as the boundary line is traced, there's a squiggle around Firozpur, and then it continues in a northeasterly direction. And suffice to say that because of that decision, I grew up in a hometown whose very air was suffused with stories of partition, stories of families that had been left behind on the other side of the border. And for us, the border is really a river. I come from Punjab, which literally means Panj Ab, the land of 5 rivers. And for us, Satluj was the river which became the boundary line between Lahore on the other side and Firozpur on this side. And literally every house had a partition story to tell. But I did what every child does, which is to ignore all of it and focus on your studies. And I remember when I was growing up, I could not wait to escape my town because my adolescence also coincided with what in India we call the Punjab problem, the Sikh militancy, that period. And so, I immersed myself in studies. I had a corporate career in Bombay, which was, 1,000 miles between me and my hometown, and I thought I was doing very well. It is only by a chance circumstance that my husband's work took us out of India, and I took a sabbatical from work, and I thought, I will just enjoy time. We were in Singapore, and there is actually a term for women of leisure. It's called Tai Tai. I thought that would do very well for me for some time before I sort of returned to my corporate career. But suffice to say that every morning when I sat, for once after a very long stretch of time, without really anything occupying me in terms of deadlines and targets to be met, there were these stories that kept surfacing, memories from my childhood, from my teenage years. And I thought, well, I'm an engineer. I know how to deal with these things. I will just put it down in a Word file and be done with it. And that is really how my literary career started, because once I started to put things down on paper and the laptop, I realized that I didn't understand why those things had happened. And to understand why those things had happened, I did what at those times people did, which is you went to the library because you didn't have Google. And so Singapore National Library Board has a wonderful network of libraries where I started spending more time. And at some point, the sabbatical time passed, and I asked for an extension of the sabbatical. And then after a year had gone by, I realized that a short story I had started writing had the seeds of a novel, and I thought I will write that. I would not advise that to most people because it is not the smartest thing to do, to leave your corporate career and say, I'll write, when you have not even trained as a writer. But I thought I was at, when something niggles you, you feel the need to scratch it over and over to find out what it is. And my journey, because we were going back to India every time, I started speaking to my family, which then I extended to my neighborhood and more people to try and understand what had happened really during 47 and why in 1984, which is sort of a watershed moment, certainly in the Sikh history, and I am a Sikh myself, and in Punjab history, when a lot of people said that it's 47 all over again. So I was trying to understand what had happened in 47 and why were these echoes 35 years later happening again in what was now a secular, independent nation of India. And so that journey started with my first book called The Long Walk Home, and I hope I have ended it with the Partition trilogy because I feel I have been carrying it for too long. And I really would like to write something like a Game of Thrones now. So what I do is in my books, I try and combine the rigor of research. So I go down the archives and say, what was history like really? What exactly happened? What are the facts on ground? And then I try and marry it with how were those impacting the people who were living through those times. And the people here are the Aam Aadmi and Aurat, which is what we call jocularly the mango people in India, people like you and me. But I'm also trying to understand what the leaders who were taking those decisions at the time were going through. So for instance, in the Partition trilogy, in all three books, there are two threads. There is something I call the Delhi thread, where I have Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and Dicky Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of India, as protagonists. So which means I'm speaking in their language. So Jawahar, Vallabh, and Dicky are my protagonists. And then there is the Aam Aadmi and Aurat thread, which in Lahore, the book Lahore is set in Lahore, in Hyderabad is set in the Nizam's region of Hyderabad, the princely state of Hyderabad, and in Kashmir is set in the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And what I'm trying to do there is to show how the decisions being taken in Delhi are impacting those on the ground. And really what I'm trying to do is what a writer, I think it was E.L. Doctorow said, that historians tell us what happened, but it's the novelist who tells us what that felt like. And I'm trying to marry the two in my novels because I feel in India we have this an abundance of WhatsApp university historians who will send us forward, multiple forwards. This is what actually happened, and it's entirely made up. And my attempt with this is to put these two things together and let the reader then come to their own conclusions. So that is the effort and the hope.
Yeah. Manreet is making it sound so clinical and scientific, but there's a lot of creativity in her work, and I'm pretty certain she's been writing as a child or something. I mean, tell us about it. I mean, you didn't suddenly start writing. That didn't happen.
No, I was a very avid reader. I think as a lot of children, certainly of our generation, I'm sure Indians in the audience will relate with that. We grew up with a lot of books. And reading was kind of the thing to be done. And since I'm assuming I have a lot of people from Kerala in the audience with us, and I want to share this. Though I was growing up in a small border town, I went to a school which was run by nuns who came all the way from Kerala. It was a convent school. And I always say I am a closet Malayali myself. Not that I understand the language, but I have a lot of love for Kerala and for the teachers who taught me, and I wouldn't be here if not for them. Yeah. So yes, the credit goes to them, to me.
So Manreet is truly, in fact, national, and now she's international. She lives here in the US and works. But then her trilogy itself takes us through Punjab and Hyderabad and Kashmir. So what was the thought behind placing the trilogy in these three regions?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question, Nirmala. I get asked that quite a lot. Well, the reasoning for it is that, as I said, I grew up in Punjab, in Firozpur, and so what was happening in Punjab, what had happened in Punjab was something which was very alive in my own family. My father's brothers studied in Lahore, FC College Lahore, and my Tayaji, which is my father's elder brother, actually had to leave in his final year because partition happened, and suddenly Lahore was not a place for non-Muslims anymore. So this history was not history. It was being told to me in stories. It was alive. It was there. And as I said, I started writing my first novel, The Long Walk Home, to understand that. But once I was spending time in the archives, I was realizing there were so many other stories that we were not talking about. So for instance, the story of Hyderabad, which is the princely state of Hyderabad, which was run by the Nizam of Hyderabad, was a converse or the exact opposite of the story of the princely state of Kashmir. Now, Kashmir is something which to this day is rankling us. It's a live issue. It's something we are still grappling with. And Hyderabad is something we've forgotten completely. So we as Indians, unfortunately, tend to have a lot of insomnia, amnesia. We are happy to keep alive things which we feel suit our agenda in a certain way and forget things which do not suit our agenda. So for instance, the three books, the way they are structured is that Lahore is set in the 9 months leading up to the independence and partition of India. And thereafter, from after 15th August 1947, the story of Hyderabad and Kashmir is unfolding in parallel. Because these, as a writer, when I was looking at these, I knew there is just so much story, so much trauma, that to put these two stories in one book would not be doing, one, justice to the stories themselves, and two, would be too much of an emotional load for a reader to bear. But we have to remember that these stories were happening in parallel. So Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, first Prime Minister of India, Vallabhbhai Patel, the first he was called the Home Minister, and Dicky Mountbatten, who stayed on as the first Governor General of India. So these men, and of course their associates, were dealing with these two very live issues. And Hyderabad was a large princely state, largest in terms of population. Kashmir was the largest princely state in terms of size, the geographical size. Hyderabad was a non-Muslim majority state ruled by a Muslim Nizam. The converse was in Kashmir, which was a Muslim majority state ruled by Maharaja Hari Singh, a Hindu emperor. And these two stories are fascinating stories, which I thought we don't talk about, because we assume that when the British decided to give us independence, they gave us the map of India that we see today. And we could not be further from the truth, because what the British did was they said that the Muslim majority states will go to Pakistan and the non-Muslim majority will stay with India. However, India at that time consisted of two binaries. There were the states which were directly ruled by the British, which was, the viceroy as a representative of the Queen. And then there were the princely states. Now, there were 565 princely states. And each of them, the British, by the laws of partition, had the option to choose to go to India, to go to Pakistan, or to stay independent. And just for our bearings, around 45% of the current map of India was with those princely states. And it was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, assisted by his very able Secretary of State called V.P. Menon, who in middle of June decided that we need to go and speak to each of these states and convince them to opt for India. Now, only two of those states were really Muslim majority. The rest were all non-Muslim majority. But they had the choice, remember, which means that the Nizam of Hyderabad could have said, look, you know what? I'm the richest man in the world. And he was. He was featured on the cover of Time magazine twice. He was Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and XYZ combined on steroids. That was his wealth. And he actually chose. Jinnah was wooing him actively because Jinnah realized that Pakistan as a new nation, the need of any new nation is what? Money. And the Nizam was the wealthiest man in the world and was a Muslim. So Jinnah was trying to woo the Nizam of Hyderabad. But as Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel said, that Hyderabad sits in the belly of India. And it's a non-Muslim majority state. That would be like having a cancer in the body of India. So he started this effort to get every one of those princely states to sign a contract which was something that the British government wanted to see, to say, okay, this will now be a part of the physical map of India. And just to give a sense of how complex this entire operation was, this endeavor was, about around 300 of these princely states were in what we nowadays call the state of Gujarat. In Gujarat, there is a region called Saurashtra, which literally means 100 nations. So a lot of these princely states were feudatories, very small principalities, but they could still choose to not be a part of India. And so this is a fascinating story which we never talk about. And once I was doing my research, I realized that there was so much drama and emotion, both in the study of this princely state of Hyderabad, which actually chose to remain independent. So when 15th August 1947 happened, we hear about Kashmir and the Kabylis, but the Nizam of Hyderabad had chosen to be independent, and he had every reason and right to do that by the laws of partition. And a year down the line, on 17 September 1948, the Indian nation rolled its tanks into the princely state of Hyderabad and annexed Hyderabad. So we went to war with our own people. It's a story we never talk about because it's convenient for us to forget that story. And similarly, in Kashmir, for instance, we say, we wring our hands and we say, oh, the trouble started with the Kabylis in October of 1947. But no, the trouble had started much earlier. And I could spend hours here, but then I would urge you to read the books to find out why I say that. But certainly in April of 1947, Maharaja Hari Singh's taxation policy, which very unfairly added a burden of taxation on people who had more than one wife. So we know which community was being targeted. So he was taxing them for more than one wife. They were being taxed for goats and sheep. And this riled these people because we have to remember that in Kashmir, and I'm talking about the erstwhile Kashmir, the princely state of Kashmir, there was a large segment called the Poonchis. Now the British, with their very wily ways where they classified some races as martial, for instance the Sikhs were a martial race. The Poonchis were a martial race. And what it really means, why it is relevant to us, is that these martial races went to war for the British on European soil. So these people had fought in World War I, they had fought in World War II. And they were demobilized soldiers, which means they come back home, but nobody has asked for their weapons back. So they have their weapons still on them. That's another thing we don't talk about. So much of the violence of partition happened because these soldiers then instigated a lot of the violence, because their understanding was that if you are, for instance, and Lahore saw the worst of it because there were the Sikhs and the Muslims, the martial races, pitted in the civil city of Lahore and literally fighting a war for partition. And so the Poonchis rebelled. They said, you can't have this unfair law. They told Hari Singh and asked Hari Singh to withdraw that taxation. He didn't. And that's when the Poonchis started reaching out to Jinnah and said, look, by all accounts, we're coming to Pakistan in August 1947. Why don't you help us now? And that set the ball rolling. So there are so many of these things which are factual, but what I'm also trying to do is to see how it impacts the life of the people on the ground. And my particular passion is looking at women, the ordinary women who had to take very tough decisions to keep their families, their children, and themselves safe in the face of extraordinary violence and brutality.
Even till this date, women in India need to strive hard to keep themselves safe on an everyday basis, even in the city.
Right.
But you also spoke, that's a very interesting perspective that you brought over there. And you've also spoken of how you once met a Punjabi gentleman who told you that nobody's hands, when it comes to partition, nobody's hands are clean. Who is this gentleman? Where did you meet him? And how did that kind of take you along the course of your storytelling?
Yeah. As I said, so I started with the idea of not of writing, I started with the idea of trying to understand what exactly had happened during partition, because certainly when I was in school, we had maybe half a page in our history textbooks which spoke about partition, because what we do in India is we celebrate independence, and rightly so, as we should, but we forget to commemorate the price of independence, which is partition. And I think it also has something to do with the fact that that price of partition was paid disproportionately by women on the ground. And the story of partition of India is very complicated. And when I was trying to understand it, going through the archives, and I started collecting my own oral archive, which is basically a fancy term for saying I was speaking with people, as I said, in my family and the broader neighborhood to understand what had happened. So I was gathering my own oral archives. And I could not understand why this had happened the way it had happened. Because a lot of times, scholars, academics, historians draw a comparison with the Holocaust, with the Jewish Holocaust. And when I came across this gentleman is when I realized why this thing was niggling me, because he said to me, and I'll say in Punjabi and then translate, which is what Nirmala said, he said, "Puttar kise de haath saaf nahi." What he said was that nobody's hands are clean. Because unlike the Jewish Holocaust, where we had very clear set of villains and victims or survivors, in the case of India's partition, there is no clear villain. This was a case of, as Bapu, Mahatma Gandhi, had foreseen and said that brother will turn against brother. he had said the Mahabharata will replay in 1947, and which is exactly what we did. And I can speak for Punjab because in Punjab, maybe you have heard of, there's a term which is called Punjabiyat. What it basically says is that everybody's identity in Punjab was certainly pre-1947. First, you were a Punjabi. Or then you were a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh. And we have to remember that a lot of these boundaries, which now, with our current very vitiated environment, we think of them as sort of iron caste and these are silos. This is not the way it was. So for instance, Guru Nanak, whose 555th birthday we celebrated just on 15th, is considered a peer by the Muslims. So he is regarded as a Sufi saint, a revered Sufi saint. You cannot travel through Punjab without finding some place of worship where Nanak is worshipped as a peer. They're called Nanak Panthis people. They're not Sikhs, they're Nanak Panthis. They follow the teachings of Nanak. And it's very common for people in Punjabis to have the same surname. For instance, a very popular surname is Malik. A Malik can be a Hindu, can be a Sikh, can be a Muslim. And therefore, in pre-1947 Punjab, there were no ghettos. There was no Muslim colony, Hindu ka mohalla hai ya Sikh ka hai. People lived cheek by jowl. And women raised each other's children, which is what women did. After the men had left for work, had their breakfast, and the women had finished cooking, they would all sit in a courtyard and somebody is sewing and there's somebody preparing their daughter's clothes for the dowry, and they are embroidering together, braiding the neighbor's daughter's hair. So yes, when suddenly partition violence erupted, and the leaders and these demobilized soldiers said, look, you got to turn against this person who wears a turban, everybody did in Punjab, but calls himself a Sikh, or wears a turban and calls himself a Muslim, or is a Hindu, you need to turn against him. And Ashish Nandi, who is India's foremost sociologist, says that this was a kind of exorcism, which was that you had to take something which was a part of your own self and cast them out. And that is why we had horrific violence, and we have not been able to talk about that violence. Which is why when the gentleman said, "Kise de haath saaf nahi," nobody's hands are clean, because everybody is implicated in this violence. The Hindus, the Muslims, the Sikhs, everybody is implicated in this violence. Which is why we prefer to not talk about it. We want to look ahead and celebrate independence and not talk about partition.
Yeah. Very, very interesting perspective. Especially living in the South, we don't encounter so many of these stories. You're pretty insulated in the southern part of the country as opposed to the north. And you've also spoken of how all of this has so much resonance with our epics, like what plays out in the Mahabharata, for instance. So could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, as I said, so in the run-up to India's independence, when it had become very clear that partition would be a cost that we would have to pay, and the nation of Pakistan would get created, Mahatma Gandhi was one of the only very senior leaders, and really, the person who led us to that point, who said that he wanted to have nothing to do with it. He, on 15th August 1947, when independence was being celebrated in India, and that was in Delhi, where first in the parliament and then the flag hoisting in the evening at Prince's Park in Delhi, Bapu was actually in Calcutta trying to prevent a communal riot, from a sectarian riot, from spreading further. And he had foreseen, and when you read his writings, he talks, he cogitates actively on how this will be a replay of the Mahabharata, the brother turning against brother. And how we like to talk about in India, we're such an ancient civilization, which we are. But one of the things with people who have a past, a very storied and ancient and old past, is that you see the spiral of history. You see that we keep circling back to the same thing over and over. So, and I'll just give you one sort of factoid to bring this alive. So, in the when we read the Mahabharata, we're told that the Pandavas, when they were trying to stay camouflage themselves so that the Kauravas couldn't find them, they took shelter in Purana Killa in Delhi, in old Delhi, right? And when partition happened and the violence erupted and people fled from what had then become Pakistan, the refugees came and were housed in Purana Killa in Delhi. And I don't know what can be more stunning sort of evocation of Bapu's fears and how they came alive in the modern nation state of India. So that's why. So our epics and are relevant. There is a reason we keep them alive. But I do have a cautionary note to add that epics and stories are always told and retold. And what writers have to do actively is to resist the mainstreaming of these stories. Because very often when we tell these stories, we are robbing certain characters of their agency. As a woman, I see very actively how the agency of Draupadi or Sita is denied to her. How the agency, which a lot of times is given to non-human animals, because remember, as humans we are animals, which is given to non-human animals, is taken away from them, because 90% of the story then starts centering on this great hero, as if that hero did that thing entirely on his own. I mean, where is Hanuman, who is sort of one of the most glorious non-human animals in the story? And Sampati, and even beyond that, the idea that kind of the engine turns, and here I'm talking like an instructor because I do teach creative writing, and a lot of it is, when does the engine of the story turn? Because when the engine turns is when the story is galloping. And for the Ramayana, the engine really turns when Sita sights the golden deer and asks Ram to go after him. And then, the fact is that it's Ravana who's basically. But the fact is that we need to step back. Sita is not just asking for the golden deer because she's greedy or she, wants to sort of keep that deer as a pet. There is a lot of storytelling before that which shows how Sita engages with the flora and the fauna and the nature. How the idea of Sita, Rama, and Lakshmana living in the forest is living in harmony with all these creatures. And how Ravana then sees that as a way to trick, to deceive, and finally abduct Sita. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to always, especially the writers and the artists, or people who are really interested in our stories, as a people, as a civilization, as a nation, we need to remember that there is a part in these stories for each one of us. The story does not belong to the hero. The story belongs to all of us. And in the telling of the story becomes the hero.
Such an interesting perspective, especially given that all our religious texts are written by men. It's all the male perspective, yeah. And we don't know whether these stories are true, so they're just there. Yeah, so the bell's gone. We can go in for audience questioning, but before that, I'd like to ask you one question, I just have a couple. So transitioning from the personal to the political, even as civil and international wars rage, right? What is the significance of electing leaders who are empathetic to displacement and loss, selfishness and chaos?
Nirmala, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. I wish we could open it to the audience because I'm sure all of us have thoughts on this. And, they say it's darkest before dawn. I at least take some comfort in that because we are living in some really dark times. In my adopted country, which is the United States, in my homeland, which is India, I feel that we seem to have unleashed these forces which have always shown that they don't last, but while they are there, their capacity to create havoc and chaos, and in many ways fundamentally change us as people is dire. We must, since my work deals with partition and I look at Pakistan very closely, and I have friends from Pakistan, and I was a young child and then grew into my adolescence during the time of Zia-ul-Haq. And Zia-ul-Haq is such a cautionary note because he, with his Islamization, his idea of Islam, which was not based in the South Asian concept of Islam, but a very Arabic, Wahhabized concept of Islam, he has fundamentally altered the fabric of Pakistan to the extent that the Punjabis in Pakistan, quite a few of them think they are closer to Saudi Arabia and the Arabs than to the Punjabis who are literally across the border. And I think it's a very cautionary tale, but I also feel that all art is political, and anybody who says that it is not is fooling themselves, certainly, if not others. And that's the time when artists go to work, so that's what we do.
Yeah. In fact, art, I always tell people fiction is the only democratic form of telling the truth.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, with that, could we have questions from the audience?
Thank you. That was a lovely conversation. Manreet, I've read several of your books. They're amazing. You have the very difficult, you have many real-life characters like Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, Mountbatten, etc., as well as fictional characters. And I was wondering how you navigate that, because you have to kind of remain a little detached and dispassionate, I guess, when it comes to the real-life people. But how do you do that? Like, do you have favorites? Do you dislike some of them? And how do you put that into the story? Because you have to weave all of this together into, it's a very nice genre of blending non-fiction with fiction. I was just wondering how you do that. So.
Yeah, no, thank you, Kamini. That's again a wonderful question, and I wish I had a nice, succinct answer that I could give to everybody. I think it just, when I thought of writing these, I really wanted my Delhi thread, which is my protagonists, who tend to be these sort of such hallowed figures, right? In India, you cannot be at any public space without at least a framed photograph of Jawaharlal Nehru or Vallabhbhai Patel or even Mahatma Gandhi. Certainly Bapu is there on all our currency notes, right? And I wanted to show them as flesh and blood characters. I wanted people to understand that these were actual human beings who were facing really tough circumstances and trying to do their best, as the charger of history is galloping ahead of them, and they literally are trying to catch up with it. And I have to say that a lot of it came from, but I was also very clear it had to be grounded in historical research, in accuracy, in fact-finding, not the least because when my publisher heard my pitch, he was, "You going to call the first Prime Minister of India Jawahar?" And I was like, yeah, because I bet when Jawaharlal Nehru looked at himself in the mirror, he didn't say Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. He was like, oh shit, what do I have to do today? And just by the way, the first thing he did when he got up in the morning was he would do a headstand. So he was a yogi who didn't need to show off that he knew how to do yoga, because he thought that was the best way to clear his mind. But that's the first thing he used to do in the morning. So what I did was, if Jawahar has to be my protagonist, then what does he do first thing in the morning? Does he drink tea or coffee, or maybe neither? Does he smoke? Does he drink? What brand of cigarettes does he smoke? 555. So what I did was, and that's why these books have been in the making for all of my writing career, because as I said, I started the journey with trying to understand who were these people, what were they doing, what made them do the things which caused my Tayaji to flee from FC College Lahore, and then every week write letters to his friend across the border and receive letters from him. That's where I was coming from. And really, that was what drove it. I think all writing is driven from a deep place of love and passion to understand your characters, to make them alive on page, And that's essentially what I have tried to do. These books also deal with issues which are of great turmoil and trauma, and I think it helps at the end of the day if you can just put it away, go for a walk, play with my cat, chat with my daughter, have a nice glass of wine with my husband, you know. So that's all. I mean, I really don't have an easy framework. You know, Ghalib said that ye आग का दरिया है और डूब के जाना है. There is no other way to do these things, but just to take the deep dive and hope that you will survive and come out the other end.
This.
Yeah, it's a bit of a delicate question. From a layperson, unbiased, you get the feeling that Kashmir, at least theoretically, should have gone there to the other side. How do you handle that? I've not read your book, I must confess. Is it between Dickey and Jawahar, was there something going on? How it remained independent? Only that portion. It became ours because of the attack and all. But how come they managed to stay independent when all the other guys came into, between the two countries?
Yeah, because by the laws of partition, they could choose to be independent. That was the agreement. The 565 princely states could choose to be independent, and on 15th August 1947, 3 states chose to be independent, which was Hyderabad, Kashmir, and a tiny state called Junagadh, which we don't even hear about, but I cover that in book 2, Hyderabad, because that gets sorted very quickly. But you have to remember that Junagadh was a very, very critical strategic location, because if you look at the map of Junagadh, Junagadh is literally an arm's throw from Karachi. And Jinnah managed to convince Junagadh, which was a Hindu majority or non-Muslim majority, and a Hindu prince, to join Pakistan later, and for the simple reason that he made promises which India was not willing to do in terms of the princely states' endowments. And what Jinnah was thinking was that he would have a naval base in Junagadh, and then it would be a short flight from there to Hyderabad. So there was a complete strategic plan how Hyderabad, whether it chooses to be independent or later, and remember, there is nothing which says that 12 months, 15 months, or 2 years later, the independent princely state of Hyderabad or Kashmir can say, hey, you know what, I tried independence, didn't like it much, I'll join Pakistan. So this was a completely legal option available to them, and they took it.
Read your book now.
Yes, please. I would urge everybody to read the books.
Hello? Yeah. So I'm just wondering if, as a writer, right, if you feel two conflicts within yourself, right? One, your responsibility to help people form their own opinions about the state of the world or so on and so forth, versus the other ethical responsibility you might feel, which is to help people pursue things like harmony and love and so on and so forth, the truth, right? So what you value or what you think society should value, right? In the age of social media, right, a lot of people are pushing their opinions onto others, right? So do you feel a conflict between two different responsibilities you might have? Helping people form their own opinion versus, suggesting or guiding them in your perspective?
Yeah, it's an interesting question you ask, and I don't know whether I have any kind of qualification to answer that really. But I think, we can agree we live in the age of social media, and what it literally means is that everybody has a loudspeaker, and depending on various factors, the amplification quotient of that can be tremendous. But I think what it doesn't change fundamentally is that there are certain things which are facts. They are realities on the ground. And many leaders have quoted, Jawaharlal Nehru certainly said that just because you disagree, it won't change the fact on the ground, right? So I think in the pre-social media age, we were all agreed upon facts. Now facts are being debated. But I still think we can push back and we can resist, and which is why, I wrote the Partition trilogy, because I'm trying to base it off ground realities and show this is what was happening and this is why it was happening and how it was impacting people on the ground. So I think as artists, as people in our community, it is our responsibility, it is our duty to talk about the facts as they exist, the reality on the ground. But then beyond that is our communal duty, in a sense, our social duty to have empathy, to try and understand where the other person is coming from, and develop our own strategies for dealing with it. You can agree to disagree and still have beer or watch something together. We don't have to kill each other for that. I mean, there is a reason why each one of us has been given the ability to think and form opinions and decide things for ourselves. So I think we have to put the sword aside and say, hey, this is what I think. This is where it comes from. What do you think? And then say, is there a common ground? Or there is always a common ground in saying, hey, you know what? We disagree, but you know what? Another day. We can still have a chat. So I think this is a very real task for each one of us, especially in the climate we are in and with the leaders we have elected willy-nilly.
Okay, I think the final call has been given to us. So we don't have time for another question, but you could meet Manreet.
I am signing books outside.
She's signing books, so she's here, she's around, okay?
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, yeah, thanks for
Well,
coming.
thank you everybody.
I think we all juggle with a million thoughts every day, right? And I think maybe perhaps we should start jotting them down, even if it doesn't turn out to be a best-selling novel. It will definitely be worth a read during our retirement at least. And it was fascinating to hear, Manreet, how you gave a fictional narrative to your research on untold facts. I was truly intrigued to hear the glimpse of the partition story from Manreet herself. There'll be book signing by Manreet outside from now and until 11:50 a.m. So whoever would like to get a signed copy of her book, you can please go out to the book signing designated area.